Welcome everyone. My name is Erin Kay and I am the co-vice chair of the A School Young Alumni Council, or AYAC, along with Matt Pinion, who will give a quick wave. We're excited to co-host this event with the school and especially thrilled that one of our AYAC members, Kendall Nicholson, will be leading the conversation. A little background on the AYAC. The council was founded in 2011 to facilitate and strengthen the connection between the UVA School of Architecture and its young alumni who are within 10 years from their graduation. This year, we launched the Alumni Mentorship Program, now in its second iteration with the class of 2021. We also recently hosted alumni career panels for prospective and current graduate students. And our members have also been involved in the school's ongoing diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations since the summer, and are engaged on various task forces to advance the school's DEI initiatives and goals.
As we wrap up our first decade as an organization, we're committed to strengthening the efforts to support the school and in particular build meaningful and lasting relationships between current students and young alumni. We'll drop a link in the chat for a listing of all of our current members. You can feel free to reach out to any of us at any time if you're interested in getting involved in the AYAC as an alumni mentor or an ambassador. We're always open to any ideas or opportunities to have better outreach to our alumni community, and you can expect to hear more from us in the coming months. Following Kendall's presentation, there'll be time for a question and answer session. Two of our AYAC members, Margaret Stella and Seshi Kanu, will be handling that and calling on folks. So if you have a question, just drop it in the chat and they will recognize you. So thanks to both of you for taking that on. Thanks again to all of you for joining us tonight. I'll pass it over to Dean Berman to introduce Kendall. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt and Erin. Good evening, everyone. It's really with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce Dr. Kendall Nicholson this evening for an inclusion and equity talk, workshop, and conversation entitled Foundations in Racism, Standing on Common Ground, hosted by our Young Alumni Council. In order for us to transform our thinking and practices and deconstruct racism, it's critical that we have a shared and deeper understanding of what it is, how it's constructed, how it operates within our social structures, disciplines, and educational institutions. It's also critical that at minimum, we have a shared understanding of terminology and a historical context for this work, which will be addressed in Kendall's talk this evening. Kendall is trained as an architectural designer. He's a researcher and scholar and is currently the Director of Research and Information for the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, or the ACSA, which is our academic professional organization in architecture that's based in Washington, DC. After his first degree in architecture, Kendall went on to complete a graduate degree in real estate and a doctorate in education, exploring the architectural discipline and its curriculum and education as a social scientist with a specific emphasis on issues of equity and race. This is manifest in some of the most recent work he's done with ACSA in the development of a research series entitled Where Are My People? Black in Architecture and Hispanic and Latinx in Architecture, that followed a series on women in architecture, and which has focused on the data and metrics and historical context of underrepresented populations within our disciplines, professions, and educational institutions. Kendall was also the lead researcher for the 2016 and 2018 Equity in Architecture Survey, sponsored by AIA San Francisco and Equity by Design. He's leading a working group on mentorship and equity for the AIA National Associate Committee. In addition, he's also a board member with AIA Richmond Board of Directors. He's also on the board of NOMA, Virginia. And most importantly, he's a UVA grad and a member now of our Young Alumni Council. And with that, we're really thrilled to have him with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kendall Nicholson.
Thank you, Dean Berman. Thank you to everyone for being here. My hope today is that we can have an open, honest conversation. That's always the goal, and I'm hoping that in the Q&A we can take a deep dive, ask the questions that have been burning in the back of your brain, and and let's talk about it. In the hopes that it gets actually a little uncomfortable, let's talk about it. So I'm not going to waste too much time because I always over prepare for these and have way too much content. So I'm going to hop into it, and then we can rock and roll. All right, can everyone see my screen here? Great. So thanks for that generous introduction. The topics for today's workshop or talk discussion, I'm going to talk and spend the first half talking about racism, white privilege, what people are saying JEDI, what was previously EDI. And then, and that's fairly text heavy. It's really kind of where I make the case for creating a shared language. And then I'll talk a little bit about real world disparities and how racism and white privilege manifest in architecture specifically. So I'd like to start with the acknowledgement that this country, this great country, the United States of America, was founded on genocide and slavery. And I think that is sometimes a hard pill for people to swallow, but I think is extraordinarily important because like anything else that we might say we love, it's important that we take a really intimate and accurate look at what it is, what patriotism means, right? So oftentimes when people talk about genocide, the genocide of Indigenous and Native people and slavery of Black people, it's thought that you are being too critical and you must be unpatriotic. And as a matter of fact, I feel like I'm quite patriotic, and even maybe more so because I'm looking at this very intently. In the same way, you know, I love my wife dearly. I love her flaws and all, right? And so I would challenge us to love the United States in the same way. And then I have the acronym BIPOC, which I'm sure many of you have seen or used here recently. And that acronym stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and really comes out as an acknowledgement to the millions of Black Americans that were enslaved, and the Indigenous people that whose land was decimated, and the harm done to Native communities. And so that's why there you've seen a transition from minority or even people of color as a whole to calling out Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So people often wonder, how does racism work? What is it? And everyone has their own idea. Racism is defined as a system of advantage based on race. And that's really important because it calls attention to the system. So it's not really about interpersonal relationships. They manifest that way, but it's really about these larger systems that oftentimes go unseen. Race we define as, or social scientists define as, a social construct of groups defined solely on physical criteria. So that can be skin color, it can be facial features, it can be nose shape, it can be hair texture. There are a lot of physical criteria that, that place people in these socially constructed groups. So when someone looks at me, they identify me as a Black man, and it really doesn't matter so much what my ethnic makeup is, which is the next point. Race is not racial identity, right? So I identify as a Black man, my mother is Black, my father is Black. If for some reason my mother, let's say hypothetically, my mother was white, and I might identify as a mixed person, I still will be raced and read as Black. I have the hair texture of a Black man, I have the skin complexion of a Black man. And so there's an important distinction there because these racial categories are not always where we want to be placed, but it might not even be where we identify. I know a number of Native Americans who are raced and read as white, but don't always feel like they identify as white. And then race and racism is always going to be supported by the history of America. And that's why you might read or find that Black, Indigenous, and people of color can't be racist. And that's largely because there was never a point in time, if we can agree that racism is a system of advantage based on race, there was never a point in time where Black, Indigenous, or people of color had substantial amounts of advantage over white people. I think it's important to note that Black, Indigenous, and people of color most certainly have prejudices and biases, as we all do. But if you're going to use the term racism, it wouldn't apply to those people groups. And then lastly, race and racism manifests through the images and messages that affirm the superiority of whites and the inferiority of people of color and Native people. I'm sorry, I'm going to watch my time here. And that's really important because that's what equals the outcomes and the effect of what people feel. So I'm going to give a big disclaimer here. These are the 5 main racial narratives. And you'll see that this slide in and of itself is extraordinarily problematic for a number of reasons. It perpetuates a lot of stereotypes. The groups are not even equally distributed. You can see at the bottom, Latinx, Middle Eastern, and Southwest Asian are all in one group. These are not groups that I created. These are groups that come out of sociology and to some extent anthropology, and really are groups that are situated around how these racial groups are characterized or manifest in our daily lives. So again, I know that these are, I hate going over this slide sometimes, but this is what I was saying at the beginning of the call. We got to be real about it. So the thought in mainstream media is that whites are thought of as being inherently good, that they work hard, that they have what they have based on merit, that they're rugged individuals, right? That they came over from England, were able to forge their own way, that they're extremely hardworking, and that they're the true Americans. For Blacks, the racial narrative for Blacks often includes some criminalization, which is why we see hyper-policing in Black communities, that they're prized for physical ability, that they aren't as smart as other people groups, and that they're often loud. And all of these adjectives and characteristics, these phrases, like I said, they manifest themselves in our everyday lives, but they also have historical origins. And I'll get to that in a slide or two. Native American or Indigenous, the racial narrative says that, or perpetuates this idea that they are savage, that they're characterized like you might see by what was formerly the Washington Redskins, but now presently I believe it's the Washington football team. And there's a large, long-standing story of alcoholism. For Asian and Pacific Islanders, their racial narrative is somewhat dichotomous. It's that they are both a model minority and that there's also this mistrust, right? So they're often seen and shown as really smart, really quiet, very respectful. And history also shows us that Americans in general have thought of Asian and Pacific Islanders as being deceptive or shifty. Think like Jackie Chan movies, this idea that you have to watch them and there's some disloyalty there. And then lastly, the 5th main racial narrative, Latinx, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian, really encompasses a lot of brown, what people identify as brown people. And it is characterized by this idea that people are illegal or that they're exotic on the other end of the spectrum, that they're lazy and that they're somehow connected to terrorism. So these are all the harmful ways. And again, I said earlier, just in case anybody is jumping in, I don't want anybody to think these are things that I think, but this is what media tells us about these racial groups. So I created, and I'll go over really briefly, this timeline of disparity I created just to look at the difference of our history, of America's history between whites and Blacks. Put really simply, you can go back approximately 400 years to the founding of the nation. And you can see on the white side is colonization, which is followed by US independence in 1776. And during both of those during both of those items of Americans' history, African Americans or Blacks are brought over and enslaved. And so you have approximately 250 years that Blacks are enslaved. They're not able to accumulate any wealth. They are seen as property. So they can be sold and traded just like you would any other capital expenditure. And during this time, however, on the white side, on the top side of the timeline, you see I have colleges and universities. So white Americans are deciding how we should speak, what we should wear, what is considered education. And they're placing value on a lot of things. They're building the country to fit where they think things are valuable. And this is going on for 250 years. And so in 1865, with the passing of the 13th Amendment, Blacks are no longer enslaved unless there's a loophole there that they can be enslaved if arrested or criminalized. So everything changes, so to speak. But now you have large numbers of Black people, specifically in the South, that that are without any means, right? They weren't allowed to gain any wealth. They weren't allowed to make a name for themselves, so to speak. So here they are left with nothing and left to go make a way for themselves. And in the Reconstruction period, right after 1865, you see what they call the Black codes, codes by which Black people needed to live to stay out of trouble. So some of those codes might include, I think down in Louisiana, there was a law that a Black man could be arrested for looking a white woman in the face. There were vagrancy laws. There were laws that you had to be employed. There were laws, a lot of different laws, essentially just a mechanism to arrest Black people across the South, really, the Jim Crow South, and put them in prisons, which would then put them back in slavery. And convict leasing goes with that. So then we have from 1865 to 1965, another 100-year time frame where Blacks are free, but still disenfranchised. We have whites only segregation, so separate dining facilities, separate spaces and transportation, separate schools, etc. And in 1965 is thought of a lot of the times as a hallmark of the civil rights movement. And you have the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which provided even more freedoms. But here we are still another 50 plus years chanting Black Lives Matter, right? Like we have made it a long way from slavery, but there's still a lot left on the table as far as being seen as equal participants. And that kind of goes back to what I said earlier about the racial narratives. So I'm going to wrap up the racial narratives here by saying here are the 5 main racial histories. For whites, whites are thought of as good and rugged individualists because they're also thought of as having founded the country and marked by colonialism. Blacks are prized for their physical ability because there was a 250-year time frame where Blacks were enslaved. There's the Reconstruction period, which I talked about, convict leasing and Black codes, which is why media manifests Blacks as criminals, and segregation. The Native Americans history books will tell you that the westward expansion was about gaining new land, without always mentioning that that land was being taken, that there were people on that land. And so that's part of the characterization of being savage that's attributed to Native people. Asian and Pacific Islander, the largest and most commonly known historical harm done against Asian and Pacific Islanders are the Japanese internment camps after the war, where Japanese people were literally rounded up and placed in camps so that Americans could keep watch on them. And then lastly, Latinx, Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian. I'm citing here the Mexican-American War or 9/11, which is much more recent. And I'll go into some of these things a little bit later. So examples and ways that these histories cause problems for us today. The first being police brutality against Black people. I won't stay here too long because there's a lot left to cover, but police brutality against Black people, the education achievement gap, that's one of my personal pet peeves, that people will note that African Americans in particular are almost always at the bottom of standardized tests, at the bottom of high school attainment, achievement in a lot of academic endeavors, without recognizing that there was a 250 year time frame, that Blacks were not allowed to learn to read and write and really be involved with education at all. And then the next piece here is generational wealth, which I'll get into. So I'm going to talk briefly about understanding white privilege. Again, I know that these are a little text heavy, and I promise you the graphics are coming, but this is important groundwork to understand some of the research I've done here recently. So white privilege is defined as the systematic advantage of being white. It's based on race, not culture, ethnicity, or nationality. So the same can be said about racial identity, which I talked about earlier. Racial identity is a line of research in and of itself that often takes people definitely through college, into their mid to late 20s a lot of the time. So white privilege is something that is placed on people who are raced and read as white, not something that they elect. So all white people benefit from racism, albeit intentional or unintentional, and I'll give 2 examples. And then the last point is that whites are intentionally taught not to see whiteness and privilege. I believe it's Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's a sociologist and former president of Spelman College, who gives the anecdote that she used to ask her students on day 1 of her courses to describe themselves in 60 seconds with as many adjectives as they can. And what would come out every time is that the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, those students would always say what race they were. And the white students would very rarely say they were white. And it just, that's an example of ways in which whites are thought of as normal, right? Like, and addressing whiteness is a thing that we're just now reckoning. Examples of white privilege include the ability to trace your family roots, the ability to find yourself represented in mainstream media with ease, the ability to consider most professional spaces as safe. That's a big one. The ability to curse or swear in public and not have it attributed to your race, and the ability to perform well in school and it not be contradictory to your race. And so research in whiteness says that developing a positive white identity requires first abandoning the focus on interpersonal as it relates to racism, which is how I started this talk, right? Racism is a system of advantage. It's not about a one-on-one interaction. And then secondly, recognizing and opposing the systems that support racism. And I think that's where sometimes it gets difficult for people. My wife, I say this all the time, my wife is white, and she's currently in a space, she's a K-2 reading teacher, and she's currently in a space that is made up of or comprised of predominantly Black students, but a predominantly white teacher, faculty body. And so every day she feels like she is having to recognize and oppose the systems of racism, put out content that is educating other white people on book choices, on ways of talking to their students, on ways of addressing behavior. And it's my opinion that she does this quite well, but these two things are essential for developing a positive white identity. So with that, we're going to take a short break from me talking, and I'm going to give you two examples. One of them, a great example of intentional use of white privilege, and the other, an unintentional example of white privilege that's as a story told by Joy DeGray. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here and switch into these links. All right, I'm hoping you all can see my screen, and we're going to hear Connor talk about his experience as a white man.
There's been plenty of times where I have consciously taken advantage of the fact that I was white, and you know, always kind of knew that if I got in trouble that I could just get a lawyer, suit up, show up, and you know, it was a slap on the wrist. I would be in jail if I wasn't white. You know, I've been arrested probably over 20 times, and you know, the only thing I have on my record to show for it is a public intoxication. And there've been some hefty drug possession charges, and I've never served time. I sold drugs. You know, I basically did whatever I wanted to do, knowing that there was going to be absolutely no consequences, you know, as what kind of the past showed me. I never felt guilt at the time because I never thought about it. But now that you mention it, there is a little bit of guilt in there, just because, you know, me talking about it openly is making me realize, damn, I'm pretty lucky.
And so this bit ends with the statistic that white men are 6 times less likely to be incarcerated than Black men. You can flip that and say Black men are 6 times more likely than white men to be incarcerated. And I call attention to that in my where are my people Black in architecture, which I'll get to later. The next piece is the unintentional example that I'd like to share. It's a little bit longer, but I would say equally as good.
My sister-in-law.
And can you all see this video? Okay.
Who's half Black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, you know, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and we, you know, it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, you know, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, you know, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, you know, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are two elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry Black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the two pieces of ID. I said, you know, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over and she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the two white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. And it's totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds, she goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half Black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the Black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So I think those are two really great examples of how white privilege can be used. I'm going to pop back over to my slideshow, and we'll talk more about those everyday examples and how Black, Indigenous, and people of color work their way through the world. But give me just a moment, and I'll go back to. Here. And one of the things Joy addressed was how to interrupt, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So now that I've tried to give a number of foundations as it relates to race and racism, I'm going to talk really briefly about real world disparities. What you see here is a graph that came from the EPI about median household income by race and ethnicity. And what you'll see is, you'll see the line for Blacks, which is in this bright blue at the very bottom at $46,000 as the median household income for Blacks. And then above that, just $10,000 above that, a red line for Hispanics. Another $20,000 above that, a green line for whites. And then you'll also see this magenta, purplish, pinkish line for Asians, which is another $20,000 plus there. And I think this is where race and racism gets really complicated, right? So as Dean Bergman shared, I've published a piece in regards to looking at race and racism as it relates to architecture. Where are my people Black in architecture? Where are my people Hispanic and Latinx in architecture? And the next piece to come out is this piece, where my people Asian and Pacific Islander in architecture. And what you'll notice, what I'm finding through my research in sociology, and then just talking to people and kind of working it via oral storytelling, is that that for Asians in particular, the disparity is not always a direct outcome, but it's always this the story of opportunity versus ownership, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that, a little more about that later. But I'll I'll suffice here to say that when Asian immigrants first came to the United States, there were a lot of stipulations that they must be educated. And so the Asian population that came over originally and largely through what we think about as the civil rights was a specific group of Asians, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that were allowed to immigrate here. But I'm calling attention also to the disparity between the $30,000 disparity between Blacks in this case and whites, and the $20,000 disparity between whites and Hispanics. Another point of real world disparity is the wealth gap, which I stated on an earlier slide. You'll see the line in red is the median household wealth for Blacks, which Statista is projecting will decrease from its current level of, I think it's actually somewhere around $10,000 and $11,000 for Blacks and Hispanic or Latinos, Latinx people, which is substantially, significantly lower than the over $100,000 median household wealth for whites. And then lastly, I'll show this. This was just brought to me by the current NOMA president, Kimberly Dowdell, who will be past president at the end of this year, which is this analysis, this piece that Time Magazine published last year about the life expectancy gap, which is extraordinarily complex and bridges climate action and environmental justice and segregation and redlining. And I mean, it touches a lot of things. I'm using this example of Washington, D.C. Because it was the city that I was most familiar with. And so Washington, D.C.'s southwest quadrant is the quadrant that's heavily populated by Black Americans. And you can see on the left that the average life expectancy there in that area is 65, 70, maybe 75 years. And the northwest quadrant of DC is often known to be the more affluent quadrant. And you can see the life expectancy there being 85 and 90 years. And so you have within a single city, and there are a list of cities here, Chicago, Washington, DC, New York, Buffalo, et cetera, that have a 25 to 30 year average life expectancy based on zip codes within the same city. And that's problematic for a number of reasons, if nothing else, just as a value of life, right? So I'm gonna switch here to talk about JEDI and JEDI Initiatives. So for a long time, I would give a presentation like this and talk about EDI. And more recently, I've added the J, not to be a little bit to be a bandwagon fan. And I say that because for me and my personal perspective is that equity, diversity, and inclusion are the type of initiatives that organizations, firms, institutions put out. And while I firmly believe that justice is important, I like to think of justice as the outcomes, right? Equity I got the gold bucket on this because equity is the way that we'll get there. It's always going to recognize history and recognize systems. Diversity initiatives are also good, but they're not actually going to be able to change anything because they're focused, diversity initiatives on the whole are focused on awareness and appreciation. And so a simple diversity initiative that many high schoolers do is like a cultural food day, right? And it is fun for high schoolers and they're able to appreciate food from different cultures, different nationalities, and they become more aware of food from different cultures and nationalities, but it doesn't actually break down any of the systems that are put in place specifically against people of color. And then inclusion has a blue bucket because it's a little bit of this blue sky thinking. Everyone loves to see the beautiful blue sky. And inclusion says that everyone's welcome, which is a little bit different than belonging. The analogy I like to give for inclusion is that I could say to you, it is 5:42 here in Central Virginia, and I could say to everyone on the call that they're invited to my house for dinner at 6:30. So that's approximately 45 minutes from now. And I think there are 80 plus people on this call, so I could say, I'm going to make sure that there are enough tables, 20 tables. I have them rented, and everyone's going to sit at a table, and I'm going to have plates for everybody, and it's going to be a wonderful meal. And I could genuinely mean that, right? Every one of you on the call is welcome to my house at 6:30 today. I can give you my address, but if I don't actually ask in advance what it is you need from me to have a successful dinner. So what are your dietary restrictions? How far away are you coming? Do you have enough money to come to my house? There are a number of questions that I would need to ask to make sure that you can get to my house successfully and actually enjoy the meal. If I make liver and bratwurst, then nobody likes that. But I've invited you to my house, then you might feel obliged to smile and say thank you. But I genuinely didn't really consider you. And so again, I'll just point back to equity. Equity is the gold standard, the gold star. It's going to recognize the histories that I talked about. It's going to recognize the systems that are in place that put those issues or disparities of wealth and education and a number of different metrics in place. So I'm going to roll through this because I've talked about this a little bit, but equity is about reassigning and reallocating resources, which is important, right? So it's one thing to, I'll give the example of a land acknowledgement. A lot of organizations and institutions and people are doing land acknowledgements to acknowledge that the land that they're on was once land that belonged to Native and Indigenous people. And I think on the whole, they are great. But they're really a diversity thing. They don't actually reallocate resources to Native people. And so if you actually stop at a land acknowledgement, then you're stopping at the acknowledgement that colonizers stole your land and we are doing great things on this land, and I'm sorry that it was stolen from you, period, right? And so sometimes these things are hard to flip. What I would suggest, if we're going to do land acknowledgements, right, is to not only make that land acknowledgement somewhat in the form of an apology, but also then to reallocate, I would say, financial resources that go back to the people group on whose land you're meeting, right? So if you have a conference, you can do that by just donating. I mean, you can make it up, right? But 10% of profit goes back to this people group. Equity is about validating the experiences of people who have had resources extracted. It's a response, not a reaction. And I put that there to say it's not like a quick draw. It's something that is thought of and orchestrated and very intentional. And then lastly, equity often feels like oppression to those who have the most privilege. And I put that out there to say that it's not always to benefit you understood, right? Like it's going to benefit different people in different scenarios, and that's perfectly okay. That's what we want. Diversity understands that there's beauty in difference. It's sometimes distilled to matching, and it's easier to achieve than equity. So it's low-hanging fruit, so to speak. It's often what schools can easily achieve, right? So the focus on recruitment, we're just going to recruit a lot of students of different color. And again, diversity is not bad in and of itself. Recruiting students of color is a great thing, specifically to architecture schools, but it's not going to break down the system, right? You could come up with an entire incoming class of Black students, but if the professors and the university as a whole doesn't really understand what it is they need to be successful, then it won't work, it will fail. And then inclusion, I'm a little bit cynical about, but I have it here. It is the easiest to achieve, doesn't actually solve any problems. Again, in and of itself, a good thing. Saying that people are welcome is very nice, and you can be well-intended, but it's not going to break down the system. So I'm going to check my time really quickly and try to take us to the end, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So I think one thing that's really important that I don't see a lot of in presentations like this is giving the tools to interrupt bias and or racism. I'm saying bias and or racism because racism is in many ways my focus, but this can be used for sexism and any of the other isms that apply. It's important to stay away from guilt, shame, and blame. And to really understand the difference between being assertive and aggressive. Oftentimes people project aggression onto people. Someone might say, if I interrupt their microaggression, that I'm being aggressive, when I'm really being assertive. And the difference is really that when you're assertive, you're speaking up for yourself or others while being respectful or respective of other people. And for aggression, you're speaking up for yourself or for others, but you're really stomping on other people. And I'm not talking about stepping on their toes. I'm talking about really just dismissing their perspective and dismissing them in totality. So the 4 ways that I find to be the most helpful. The first one is to stop. So I like to give the example of, let's say all of us are sitting outside of a restaurant better yet, we're sitting in a board meeting or some sort of faculty meeting, and I, as a Black man, I'm sitting beside you and I'm eating a bucket of fried chicken, right? And let's say a white colleague of mine leans over and makes what is an obviously racist joke about Blacks eating fried chicken or Blacks and something about eating. The first thing someone could do if they didn't feel like they were really well equipped to handle it is just to look at the person. I'm going to call this person John. To look at John and say, John, stop. That is really rude, right? And they can let that be. They might not know John that well, etc. The second thing they can do is to, in some ways, put John on the spot. So John leans over to me or leans over to another colleague and makes a really racist remark or joke about me eating fried chicken. The person could say, hey, John, I hear you telling a joke and it looks like you think that's really funny. Can you tell me more? And ask him to kind of explain what it is about this joke that is really funny. And that just kind of engenders the conversation. Might be an easy way in. The third one is called felt, found, and feel. And felt, found, and feel is really, really better used from a dominant person to another dominant person, which Joy DeGree talked about in her grocery store example, right? She, in that moment, was grateful to have her sister-in-law, who was raced and read as white, even though she was biracial, to intercede. And her sister-in-law essentially asked questions and said, stop. But in this case, we're sitting at a table. John leans over to me, makes a racist joke. It would be nice if I could wait there just for a split second and have one of my white colleagues say to John, hey, John, I hear you making this, they could say something like, hey, John, I hear you making this joke and it really landed as racist or not okay, right? And so they're gonna focus their attention on the joke, not on John, on what he said, how it landed, it came across as racist. And then they're gonna say something to the effect of, they might say, hey, I wanna talk to you in the hallway, or stop by my office later, or something. They could do it in the moment, they could do it later, but essentially they're gonna get to this felt, found, feel, which is to say, John, I once felt, or I used to think that these jokes were really funny. I told many of these jokes in my day, you know, back in college, whatever. I'm being imaginative here, but I once thought these jokes were funny. And then I found out that they were actually really hurtful, and that they have long histories of, in this case, you know, mammies and slaves in the kitchen and things of that nature. And so now I feel that these jokes are not okay. And I would guess if you asked Kendall, he probably didn't take it well. Like he probably felt like, you know, he was being ostracized. And so felt, found, feel, that's one way to interrupt bias and racism. And then, as I stated earlier, just to always focus on the action instead of the person. And that's really done in some ways as a courtesy to the person, but it's really done because research shows that if you start, if you're not, careful is not the word I want to use, but if you go for the person instead of the action, they're usually very quickly, the person's defenses will go up. Even if you go over the action, the person's defenses might go up, right? But calling attention to the action is really important here. And then I think I have 2 or 3 slides here on signals. So I'm using the term signals really as a way of indicating belonging and safety to BIPOC people or students. And so I'll speak for myself and say, as a Black man who works and lives in predominantly white spaces, who you know, went to a predominantly white school, and needed to be able to code switch and be very successful in white spaces, I had to be aware of my surroundings, and I was always on a search for belonging and safety, right? Like, so if I'm in a, let's say a friend invites me out to drinks or something, I might go and I'm gonna quickly, it's almost like innate now, I quickly scan the room and just see who's in the room. Am I the only Black person in the room? Are there other people of color in the room? You know, there are a number of different ways that I might scan for that. This can also be found in website, pictures, text, conversations. It could be a look that someone gives you. It could be in the food that you're eating, like, oh, okay, this is somebody, even if you don't see the person, you might know that there's somebody from your cultural, ethnic, or racial group there. I'm gonna give 2 examples, and I'm picking on NCARB a little bit here. This is the NCARB board for the past approximately the past 4 years. This might not include this year's board, but as you can see, it's a largely white board in what appears to be an affluent hotel space. And so if I go to NCARB's website and I see this is who NCARB's leadership is, I'm not gonna get any signals that tell me that I might be welcome there. If anything, I might get a signal that says they may not understand my experience. On the contrary, they tend to have really diverse think tanks. So this is, I think, the most recent think tank group by NCARB. And so if I go to their website and I see this picture, I might say, it looks like they understand where people come from and value voices from all across the country, you know, different racial and ethnic groups, and that's really important. So as these things relate to architecture, I'm gonna go through the equity in architecture work that I did in 2018 here, and then some of the Where My People research, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I spent a long time painting the picture with background, with understanding some of these terms, with understanding how race works in America, because you have to have that lens, so to speak, to be able to understand these graphics. This first graph is about race, but it's actually, I like to think about it more as it relates to gender. In 2018, the Equity in Architecture Survey gathered over 14,000 responses, and this was the gender breakdown. So as it relates to architecture specifically, it's probably actually oversampling women because the split is not quite 50-50. But you can see what's promising in some regards is that you can see as we go younger on the scale, so on the far left, you see 18 to 24-year-olds. That group was much more female, much more diverse than the group that's on the 75 or older, or identified as 75 or older. And so we can see, and the National Architectural Accrediting Board, NAB, also shares student breakdowns for the architecture pipeline. And it shows that the younger we go, the more diverse the profession is, or the field is. This next slide looks at average current debt. And I'll really quickly call attention to the two demographic groups that had the highest average debt, specifically right out of college in 2016 timeframe, were Black males and Black females with Masters of Architecture degrees. And that's important. And so if you don't understand the median household income and the wealth gap, then it's going to be hard to really figure out why this is, right? And then the lowest average debt actually came from Asian or East Indian women with B-arcs or M-arcs. And so I usually talk about this graph and call attention to the fact that the average, which is that dotted line in the middle, comes out to be about 40,000, and for Blacks with a Master's of Architecture degree, their average debt is 2.5 times that. Research in sociology, again, shows that the strongest predictor for socioeconomic status is parental educational attainment. And so that's what we use to try to better understand the socioeconomics of the respondents that we surveyed. You'll see on both the female and male side that Hispanics and Blacks were more likely than other racial groups to be first-generation students, or to report that their parents had some college. Which again, for Blacks in particular, if we go back to the 250-year time frame where Blacks weren't allowed to learn to read and write, and then another 100 or so years where they were fighting to be included at universities like the University of Virginia and other elite institutions, that corresponds to that directly. This last one I include because not because there was this stark difference between white and people of color, but really because when we surveyed those 14,000 people, we asked whom does your work positively impact? And at the very lowest number here on the far right hand side, you'll see underserved communities. And so as architects, I kind of take issue with this idea that that it's only to architects that architects are socially just, right? Like internally, we know that architects have great power to rectify wrongs and implement equitable changes in communities, but nobody else knows that. And for that reason, we kind of think of work that serves underserved communities as exceptional, right? Like, so, oh, you have some special firm set up and do some special pro bono work, and you serve underserved communities. And I don't think it has to be that way. It'd be interesting to survey this again and see if the response has changed over the past 2 or 3 years. The Black in Architecture piece that I published really just called, and I'm gonna move through these fairly quickly, we can talk about them more if someone is interested, but really called attention to the Black in Architecture in specific was based loosely on W.E. Du Bois. He has a set of research and data visualizations that I think are quite telling, that look at African Americans in Atlanta in the 1800s. But this slide in particular really calls attention to the problem of the prison industrial complex, right? That 32% of the Senate's prison population are Black males, and that's including women. Like when I look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Justice Statistics publishes these numbers that allow you to look in totality at the prison population, and 32% of the prison population are Black men. But in the profession, just under 2% of the licensed architects identify as such. Another thing I looked at was what type of programs Black and African American students enrolled in and graduated from. And so the majority of Black students enrolled in pre-professional programs, which was not the case for white or Caucasian students. As you can see, 55 for Black or Asian American or African Americans, excuse me, and 58 for whites or Caucasians. And then this slide really just talks about how small the population is of Black women in architecture. So that even within that small group, NAB reports 5% of the student population across the country identify as Black students. And of that 5%, Black women make up 1 out of every 3 Black architecture students. I know that's a little bit complicated, but this is here on ACSA's website, and you can read it further if you so choose. And then last month I published Where Are My People Hispanic or Latinx in Architecture. As I stated earlier, I called attention to the secession of some of Mexico's land to the United States, which I call attention to in this slide. And then I've pointed out on the left-hand side where all the Hispanic serving institutions are. And you can see that there's this large overlap that includes parts of Texas and the Mexican border, Puerto Rico and the coast of Florida. And then you can see Chicago's and New York are also highlighted there in the north. But I say that to say our history matters, right? Like, why is it that the Hispanic serving institutions are largely in the South on what was once Mexico and on the border of Mexico and the coast of Florida and Puerto Rico? It's because of our history. This slide looks at a lot of different metrics in society and in architecture. And so you'll see the sentence prison population. So 18.5% of the US population, or people living in the United States, identify as Hispanic or Latinx. And so when you look at numbers of unemployment, which you'll see here in the red, these are the metrics. Unemployment shows that 20.8% of those without employment identify as Hispanic or Latinx. One great thing was that we saw an overpopulation or oversampling of people who identified as Hispanic or Latinx among all college students. And then unfortunately, much like what I stated originally for Black men, when we look at the sentence prisoners, 23.4% of them identified as Hispanic or Latinx. And with this, I was able to actually send out a survey that gathered responses from people who identified as Hispanic or Latinx, asking them what it means to be Hispanic or Latinx. And a lot came out of that. I was able to do that part qualitatively and code the language that was used. A lot of talk about Latinx and Hispanic history. As you can see, our ancestors built massive and complex cities and structures that still stand today. And that it wasn't always clear and straightforward, right? Like on the far left-hand side, you see being Latinx in architecture is a privilege, a struggle, lonely, empowering, exciting, and a great honor. When I asked one area that is significant to the Hispanic or Latinx community, but insignificant to architecture, people talked largely about family, and I go into that in the article. the perspective of family is different than what is thought of as a traditional white American perspective of family. And then the idea that architecture is a social and political tool. I have a quote here also about immigration reform and poverty, even though I wouldn't say that was a really large part of the text that came out of these questions. It was definitely there. And then lastly, we asked them to tell us or tell me about their experience realizing their racial identity. And so in these responses, we saw some of the complexity of colorism and people, white Hispanics, maybe not identifying as people of color, but also knowing that they spoke a different language and had different cultural underpinnings, and trying to navigate that. So with that, I would love to open it up for questions. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm hoping that you all have that we can engage in some dialogue here. I'd love to hear questions and talk more about this as you all are interested. Thank you.
Hey, Kendall, I'll ask a question.
Hey, Betsy.
It's Betsy. I was really struck by the story that you showed us about the woman in the grocery store and the sort of the blatancy of that situation. It was so clearly, so to speak, black and white about the treatment that she received. And the fact that her sister-in-law was able to step in and use her white privilege to remedy the situation was remarkable. How can we, if we don't find ourselves in situations like that, do you have suggestions for how we can, I'm not thinking go out and put ourselves in those situations, but how, as we live our lives as white people, what can we do to find situations or to be helpful in a genuine way that's not contrived?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. My wife and I talk a little bit about, and I might have been talking with someone on this call, I'm glad to see some familiar faces, but a little bit about how not to take up space and ways in which white people like her can be effective. And so, the work in sociology talks about taking up space being inserting yourself in an environment where you as an outsider, and I'm saying you understood, you as an outsider are trumping the experience or the ability for people who have that firsthand experience to share, right? So I think you always have to be careful of that. And I think that's what I hear in your question about not being contrived.
Yeah.
I think the best way to do it is actually to support organizations that do that work already, right? So in architecture, everyone is linking up with NOMA at this point in time because NOMA already does the work, right? And
Right,
so
right.
Contributing time, contributing finances, contributing resources is a great way to interact and interject to allow them to do the work that they've been doing for years, but is just now being noticed. I think on an interpersonal level, that if once your lens has shifted, you kind of can't miss it. So it'll be hard to, it'll just be hard. The other day, in regards to that story that Joy shared, it was probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, I guess there's a recognition that these experiences are not like one-offs. And it took my wife a long time to understand that too, where I would go somewhere, have an experience, and I would call her or say to her, like, something about that just was wrong. I felt like this person was pretty racist. And she's like, no, no, because she was there too, right? She saw something happen and she's like, no, I think it was probably just a misunderstanding. And it takes some time for people to really realize that this happens all the time. I'll give a short anecdote. I needed to get a new key for my car, and I live in Central Virginia. So I called around and talked to, which on the phone sounded like a Southern white guy, sounded really nice. So I set up an appointment, took my car there, got there and got to the door, and there was this huge Trump sign on the door. And so because I work in race and equity and a lot of different things, I thought, I wonder, should I have a conversation with him? So I went in, I let him service my car. He fixed the key. He was even so kind to give me, he knew I had an extra key and he's like, hey, I can fix that up. And then if it breaks, it's fine, but you already have 2 other keys. So I thought, because he was so kind to me, I thought I really need to ask him and see why it is that he feels it's so important to have this Trump sign out when we, know that the president in this case espouses really racist ideologies and language. And as soon as I asked him that question, racism came flowing out of his mouth. Like it was one thing after another. Yeah, I see Black people come in here with their pants sagging and they do this and they do that, and they just need to get jobs and they need to. And I thought, this person was really so kind to me. And it goes to my point about signals, right? Like the signal for me was the Trump sign. And so as a Black man living in America, I've learned to work with a little bit of a fence, I guess, because you never actually know what people are thinking. And it really took me asking him one question for him to share all of the terrible things he thought about Black people in this case.
All right, we have Brandon who has a raised hand.
Yeah, how you doing, Dr. Nicholson? My name is Brandon Ely. I'm a 3rd-year undergrad right now at UVA in the A school. And I had a question about, what do you think the importance is of exposure to the architecture discipline at a young age, considering that when I asked my white classmates about how they chose to study architecture, a lot of them had parents who were either developers, architects, or went to the A school or something like that. But that's not the case with myself or my Black colleagues.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Brandon. I've been in your shoes before. So I think one of the things I didn't share is that I used to work as a K-12 teacher. I worked predominantly with grades 6 through 12, but I think that was extraordinarily important because I find, for a number of reasons. One, children are sponges, right? So they take in whatever it is you give them. And I think working at a younger age really allows them to use their imagination to see not only the built environment, but the environment largely, which is sometimes not really included in classrooms. When we did the 2018 Equity in Architecture, I believe it is, we asked that very question, like, how were you introduced to architecture? And most of our respondents stated that they had visited a significant building or site. And I can tell you anecdotally, as a child, I used to go through, whenever we go through the grocery store, I would stop in the checkout line at the magazines and look through either the home decor or the house plans, usually house plans, and just kind of look through them. And I thought they were so fascinating and so wonderful. But I think it's really important to go young for another reason being that architecture is not always thought of as socially relevant, right? Like the question I like to ask people, and I'm sure many of you have heard me say this before, is how would your grandmother define architecture? My late grandmother never interacted with an architect, right? And I think that's problematic because I think there's a lot of potential there that people just don't really, they just don't really know what architects do. And then my last point is, I think you can feed 2 birds with 1 stone, right? you can talk to students, and I think Isla and I might have had a discussion about this, but if you go young, you can talk to students who then go home and tell their parents, like, this is what I learned today. Parents ask, what did you learn at school today? I learned about architecture, and I learned that it can help change the world. It can really be that simple, right? Like they design buildings and landscapes, and they help us change the world. So that would be my 2 cents. But I think it's really important. You can't be what you can't see.
Thank you.
And we have a chat or a question in the chat from Michelle Hoffner. And she says, I wonder, Kendall, if you've done or plan to do any research or study of sexual orientation and gender identity in architecture.
Thank you, Michelle, for that question. So we tried to do some of that work in the 2018 Equity in Architecture survey by asking for gender identity and sexual orientation. And the population that we got was so small that we couldn't necessarily parse out, like we reported a little bit on sexual orientation, but there wasn't really much we could do with gender identity as far as parsing out some of those outcomes. So even if we had a population, let's say if we, and this wasn't the exact number, but let's say, in this case, we surveyed over 14,000 responses. And I think the number that came back for people who identified with a specific, identified their sexual orientation as being other than heterosexual, I think that group was something like 300. And so while that's a pretty significant number, it's not necessarily enough for us to look at, to make even a chart that says years of experience and salary, right? Because at the top in the 70 plus range, there may be 1 or 2 people. And so it will quickly identify who might have responded to the survey. But Michelle, I will say, if this is something you're passionate about, reach out to me. And I'm sure between myself, between the people at Equity in Architecture, like we can figure out a focus group, or we can figure out a way to collect qualitative data that allows people to share stories. Like I think it would, I think it's very timely, and I think it could change the profession just by nature of acknowledging different gender identities and et cetera. Thank you.
All right, and I see a raised hand from Mona.
Thank you. Thank you, Kendall, for this really important presentation, all of the insight that you could share with all of us. I have a question in relationship to your comment that you made in reference to the fact that this country is built on stolen land, and that recognizing this is a good first step, but that it shouldn't stay just by identifying this, and that there should be actually a payment that should be given back to those communities from whom this land was stolen. I think it's a really, really important point. And ideally, this would be something that comes from the government, and there's a taxation, and there's somehow, or it's not a question of willingness, but it's simply happening. But this will probably take a long time. But you mentioned a couple of steps that we can do as representatives of institutions, people who are organizing conferences, etc. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about these opportunities, how we can help with this?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thanks for your question. I'll say, yeah, I didn't even really get into the case for reparations. If anyone hasn't read Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2000, and it's been a few years, it might be like 2014 or 15, he published an article in The Atlantic that's called The Case for Reparations. And he speaks specifically about the Black experience and calling for action for reparations for Black Americans. But the same argument can be made for Indigenous people very easily. In regards to things that institutions, conference organizers, firms, other organizations can do, I think the hardest thing or the hardest shift to make is to go from diversity, which people have been doing for a long time, right? Recruiting new people, but from diversity to equity. And so another example of equity is that's often argued against is like affirmative action. So thinking about who you, in the case of a conference, it would be who you've invited to speak at a conference. In the case of the workplace, how you do your hiring. Affirmative action was never actually meant, despite what people believe, it was never meant to be a way to meet quotas. And it's never intended to hire or allow someone without the appropriate qualifications to have a job or be in a space. It's actually, though, intended for people to expand and to at the same time expand and narrow what it is you're looking for. So let's say in the case of a faculty hire, you might set out a list of criteria for said faculty with fairly great specificity that might actually include a knowledge or a history, some experience working with people from diverse backgrounds, Black, Indigenous people. You could put that in the hiring announcement, right? And then you get people who come and apply, and affirmative action says that you stick to, or goal-oriented affirmative action says you stick to the goals. We want a person that meets these qualifications. And so when I get 20 applications, if I have, let's say I have a Black person that meets these qualifications, and I have a white person that mostly meets these qualifications, but also attended a really elite university. So in my head, I'm giving him or her a bonus point for that. Also spent a year in France doing a specific internship, right? I'm giving them a feather in their cap for that, but that's not actually a part of what it is I said I'm looking for. And those are the ways in which privilege works its way in, and then the person who doesn't necessarily have those privileges gets the short end of the stick. I hope I'm answering your question. It's kind of
Can I jump in maybe?
Yeah.
So I think all of this is super important, but maybe my question was more in relationship to a direct act that allows, let's say, UVA, who is the first owner of land that was directly stolen. So it's not that it had been sold 500 times in between, but it happens through the institution, that this institution can repair and pay back, not only by hiring BIPOC candidates, but literally paying back to the community. I was somehow hoping that this exists as a model, because I think this would be the fair act to do.
Yeah, there's not a model that I know of. There are many things that I could imagine, right? Like I could imagine a series of stipends. I could imagine them literally giving land back. What, how groundbreaking would that be? To actually say, we took this land and we're gonna give some of it back because it was never ours to take. But all of the things that I can think of are like wish list things. I don't know that I know of anything off the top of my head that has been done and could be replicated. But that's a good question, and we should. I mean, I'll look into it and reach back out if that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
And we have another question in the chat from Linda Cripps. I'm Architecture 78, and the fact that we've been having this conversation is amazing and encouraging. What would you hope or wish to see about the state of architecture students in the practice in 2050 and beyond as a result of your work?
That's a great question. Thank you, Linda, for that question. 2050. Let's see, that's 30 years from now. 30 years from now, I would hope that one of my passions is modeling and modifying architecture curriculum. So I would hope that curriculum across the country would look really different, that we would prioritize potential over past experience, as Brandon stated. Like people come in with different levels of connection to the profession. And I think we need to look future towards the future and less about past performance or how someone's done. I would say also, I think the realization that we have to be somewhat dogmatic about how we define architecture. One of the beauties as one who studies architectural education, one of the beauties of architectural education is that it's drastically diverse, right? UVA is not like Virginia Tech, and Virginia Tech is not like Hampton, and Hampton is not like, you know, we could go on. Everyone has a bit of a different philosophy, a different way of preparing students. And I love that. But one shortfall that comes out of that is the inability to define architecture. And as I stated earlier, because we don't define it for ourselves, it's very hard for us to communicate our value out to the public, whether that be in the federal government, whether that be to people on the ground. I mean, there are a lot of different ways. So I would say two things, if I can summarize it, is one, I would hope that architectural education and practice would be more intentional about equity and social relevancy, and that the curriculum in and of itself would veer away from the master apprentice model toward something that's truly more collaborative and I'll say inclusive, even though I was a little bit cynical of that term.
All right, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Elizabeth. How would you change content, especially in studios, to address EDI issues?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks, Elizabeth. I think in regards to studios, so architectural history has started to do some of this work. And I think for studios, there's currently an elevation of the artifact and the environment. And this is my own personal kind of opinion and read of design studios, right? And so after the artifact is made beautiful and functional and you know, has a specific form that's intentional, and the environment is considered, then we consider the people. And I would say that we should move the people to the front, right? Like, think about really intentionally who the space is for, how people have historically made their way through spaces, understand what cultural norms are for said people group, whether it be based on region or based on a cultural connection, and then let the form and the environment, respect for the environment, which are also really important things, come out of that. But I think until we learn to prioritize people first, I think we're always going to be stuck in the space itself as an artifact and as an artistry. And that obviously varies by institution. I think it was Robert Stern, don't quote me on this, but I think Robert Stern led a studio at Yale years ago about the prison pipeline and restorative justice. And that was one really great example of how you can transform a studio to be really specific and really intentional and really design oriented in an equitable way.
On that note, we are out of time and we want to be respectful of Kendall's next obligation. So we'll do another round of applause to you, Kendall. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your research with us. I'm sure we could talk with you for many hours, and thank you all for joining us this evening.